The sinking of the Titanic remains one of the most horrendous disasters in maritime history, even 100 years later. The ship was considered to be unsinkable, though this claim would be put to the test when the ship struck an iceberg, leading it to split in half, sink to the bottom of the ocean, and claim the lives of at least 1,500 people. What makes this sinking so interesting is that we don't know much about what happened from the time the ship struck the ice to the time it sank to the depths of the ocean. According to most eyewitnesses and professional investigations, the leading cause of death was a lack of lifeboats. It seems that the crew and passengers would have mostly been able to survive if there were enough boats on the ship, or if the small number of boats they had would only have been packed to full capacity. Whatever the reason was behind only putting a handful of people on each boat, we may never know. New documents have now been released that claim to tell the story about what happened from the time the ship began to flood to the moment before it became completely submerged. These documents give us amazing insight into how things would have played out during the time the lifeboats were heading to the shores of New York. This has led many people to question how the rescue teams handled the survivors and how they dealt with those who may have passed away after the crash. But before we get started, be sure to hit that like button and ring the notification bell for more videos. New letters give insight into the rescue missions. As the Titanic sent out its many calls for help, it soon became clear that there were no ships in the nearby area that would be able to help save the passengers from their fates. Because of this, it would take many hours before another ship would pass by, meaning that virtually everyone who was unable to board a lifeboat would lose their lives in the freezing waters. If you've seen the Titanic film, you probably understand that the story about Jack and Rose is not real. However, Jack losing his life just minutes after entering the frozen water would have been a very real scenario for most of the passengers. When rescue ships finally arrived several hours later, they realized they were not on a rescue mission at all, rather a recovery mission. Several ships showed up to search for survivors, but many of them realized that there were very few survivors to be found. This meant that they resorted to cleaning up the surrounding waters and retrieving as many bodies as they could. Even though these individuals lost their lives at sea, family members still wanted to bring the bodies back to shore so that they could be identified and given a proper burial. Several telegrams showed images of what the rescue ships faced as they made their way toward the Titanic wreckage. They were greeted with huge amounts of debris in the water, making it very difficult to determine where many of the bodies were located. Thankfully, most of the passengers had been wearing life jackets. However, these jackets could not save them from their fate, as the water was simply too cold. As rescue ships began to swarm, it became very clear that there would not be enough room on board the ships to house the sheer number of bodies they had begun to collect. Most of these ships were not cooled properly, or were not insulated enough to store bodies in such conditions without risking the bodies beginning to decay before making it to land. With the sun beating down, they couldn't simply store the bodies on the deck. They needed to be properly insulated in a freezer. This meant most of the ships only retrieved a handful of passengers, if any at all. As telegrams continued to make their way to the public, White Star Line made it very clear that they wanted to retrieve as many people as possible, dead or alive. But since many of these ships didn't have enough room to hold all of the bodies, many of them were simply thrown back into the sea as they drew closer to shore. This is truly a morbid fate, but it's the harsh reality of what took place that evening. What makes the story even more tragic is that class played a major role in who survived and who lost their lives. We know that the first and second class passengers were given preference over the third class. The first class passengers were allowed on the lifeboats first, then the second, then the third. This meant that many third-class passengers simply didn't have enough time to make it to the lifeboats before the ship had already sunk. This would also play out as rescuers were retrieving bodies. It wasn't uncommon for the body of a third-class passenger to be dumped back into the sea, while the body of a first-class passenger would have been picked up and brought back to shore. The vast majority of bodies that would be found later on, months or years down the road, would have been third-class passengers. What caused the ship to sink? In the years since the Titanic suffered such a terrible tragedy, virtually every aspect of the ship's maiden voyage has been called into question. Researchers have investigated the actions of the captain, the crew, passengers, and almost every possible scenario that could have led to such a disaster. One of the biggest issues became apparent straight away: a lack of communication. Considering how many transmissions were coming and going from the Titanic at the time, there were far too many messages for the crew to keep track of. This meant that certain messages were given priority over others. Sadly, this seems to have also been true for the reports of freezing water conditions that would have gone blissfully unnoticed. Several other ships had sent transmissions that warned of the freezing conditions, doing their best to keep the Titanic and other ships free from danger. However, it's been theorized that many of these messages were ignored or missed entirely. Whether this was the fault of the crew or simply the fault of an overwhelmed transmission system, we may never know. However, it does seem very clear that the Titanic was warned about the impending danger, yet did nothing to change the course of the journey. Even when messages were received, researchers claim that the captain was not informed about all of the transmissions that were pouring in. This prevented him from being able to react accordingly and eventually led to the ship's downfall. Regardless of whose fault it was, if the captain had been informed about the icy conditions and the icebergs that were lurking just below the surface of the water, the ship would have been able to survive, as the captain would have easily been able to change the path of the ship and steer it to safety. Speed. One of the major aspects that led to the ship's downfall has not often been covered by researchers and reporters. Most people don't realize the Titanic was traveling at incredibly fast speeds. At the time, many ocean liners were competing to see who could get a ship from Europe to America in the shortest time possible. The trophy was passed around like a plate of hot biscuits, and the crew who worked on the Titanic wanted to claim their portion of the prize. Because of this, not only was the Titanic one of the largest ships ever built at the time, but it was also the fastest. It was this speed that likely played a major role in the ship sinking, as there simply isn't enough time to keep the ship from striking the iceberg that lay ahead. By all means, it does seem clear that the crew noticed the iceberg before striking it. It also seems obvious that the crew and captain did their best to make adjustments before impact, but there simply wasn't enough time to react accordingly. The crew did their best to follow a reverse steering maneuver to slow the ship down, but it was too late. With only a small window of time to slow the ship down, reverse its course, and steer it to safety, the ship was doomed from the start. If the Titanic had been traveling at a more reasonable speed, it's likely the crew would have been able to steer clear of the iceberg. Worse yet, if the ship was still doomed to strike the iceberg, yet it had been traveling at a slower speed, it would have been less likely for the iceberg to penetrate the ship, meaning it may have been damaged. But thousands of gallons of seawater would not have flowed in, meaning the ship could have been saved and likely repaired once it made its way into the port. Lifeboats. One of the most obvious reasons behind the Titanic disaster is the lack of lifeboats. We all know the ship was fitted with far too few lifeboats for the number of passengers who were on board. However, this situation gets far worse when you realize the boats were not packed to full capacity. Many of the lifeboats had less than 75% of the number of people they should have. Some boats even left the wreckage with only a handful of people on board. According to some researchers, if the boats had all been packed to capacity, the loss of life would have only been around 300 people. Yes, this number is still far too high, considering the tragedy could have been easily avoided. However, the deaths of 300 people are far more acceptable compared to 1,500. Insurance fraud. One of the wildest theories about the Titanic is that the entire sinking was an insurance scam. Those who were present at the time the Titanic was in the docks reported that the Olympic had suffered severe damage to its hull after colliding with a warship just a short while before the Titanic was set to take off on its maiden voyage. Some conspiracy theorists claim this damage was never repaired. Instead, the nameplates from the Titanic and the Olympic were swapped, with the owner of the building company planning on sinking the ship at sea in order to claim the insurance money and keep from having to invest in repairs. This theory makes a lot of sense, and it only becomes more believable when you realize the Titanic's owner had made plans to participate in the maiden voyage, yet canceled his plans on short notice just before the Titanic was set to leave the docks. There's also the strange coincidence that the damage sustained by the Titanic from the iceberg would have been in the exact location of the damage sustained by the Olympic in its crash a short while before. This seems pretty believable, right? Well, not exactly. When examining the wreckage of the Titanic, researchers took detailed photos of the hull of the ship, and investigators many years later continue to use the photos to determine what went wrong on the Titanic that fateful evening. In these photos, you can clearly see the hull is stamped with build number 401. If the ship were really a rebadged version of the Olympic, this build number would have read 400. This tiny bit of information completely turns the insurance fraud idea on its head, proving that this was not an insurance scam at all. At the end of the day, it seems like the Titanic's crash was merely the product of human error and a lack of preparation by the crew and builders. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like button and ring the notification bell for more videos.